Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the official Oscarina nomination coverage for Legend of the Mystical Ninja, Shining in the Darkness, Super C, UN Squadron, and Super Mario World. Mystical Ninja and Shining both garnered 2 nominations, while the other 3 have 1 each. These games all share 2 things in common. One is that they are the only 5 games not nominated for Best Pixel, and they have a fairly low nomination count. Given this, I thought it best to simply discuss each of them in one video rather than make short 3 to 5 minute videos for each one individually. The order is more or less a subject of personal preference, but I have structured the dialogue such that similar categories are in close proximity to make for easy listening. With all that said, my name is Mitchell and I'll be your host for the evening. So let's kick things off with Legend of the Mystical Ninja. Legend of the Mystical Ninja is an adventure game set in ancient yet modern Japan, where ghosts live and cats talk. It's a Konami game through and through, and unlike anything you're liable to see on the console, if not in general. It is up for 2 awards, including Best Art Direction and Best Musical Score. Mystical Ninja is a mixture of platforming, minigames, light puzzle action, and the occasional boss. As you tour this alternate Japan, you'll encounter all sorts of interesting characters. Most of them are after your wallet, and they'll attempt to get you to spend money on food, games, quizzes, the lottery, spa, ninjutsu training, and arcades, including one that can literally play Gradius. The mere act of picking up this game at all is a discovery. And what this all adds up to is some highly creative art and music. So we'll start with the art direction. When you enter a house, you're often faced with a unique interior and a unique NPC, and that makes sense. The spa owner isn't the same person as the fortune teller, but the game goes in on this even further to compose an entirely new piece of music for most of all of these encounters, culminating in a truly engaging world to explore. The game also boasts 2 unique playable characters that aren't color swap sprites, and the same is true for many of the characters you'll encounter. In fact, many of your common enemies are unique to each area, and many of them appear to be going about their business, adding a nice touch to the reality of the experience. It's entirely possible Yin and his friend Dr. Yang are really just mischievous tramps rampaging through Japan, but that adds to the charming effect of it all. The art reaches new heights when you get to the later levels. This boss in particular is so creatively composed that you'd be hard-pressed to find a game with more imagination than Mystical Ninja. I really love how the face of the boss falls apart like a Mr. Potato Head and has to reconstruct itself near the end of the fight. It will grow larger with each blow until it's encompassing the entire screen. And this is the kind of game that knows when to have everything take a backseat and just let the art assets breathe. I don't know if I'd say the game covers much in terms of range, but it does stretch itself for all there is with the aesthetic style it's going for. And had it looked differently, it'd be much harder to understand the way in which it needs to be received. The game is funky as hell, and it's the kind of funky that works, and the art is a key way in which it's able to communicate to the player to relax and be ready to laugh. And beyond that, there's some really beautiful backdrops, some clever implementation of environmental gameplay interactions, and all around a really strong visual aesthetic that speaks for itself. When it comes to music, I'll be paraphrasing another member's arguments as well as providing a few comments of my own. In general, the soundtrack for Mystical Ninja is unique, diverse, consistent in quality, and quite long, though that final point does come with a bit of a caveat that I'll explain later. There is an impressive 83 songs for what's actually a fairly short game, and it's worth noting that the composers didn't slack off when it would have been easy to. Most of the music is less ambient, and hardly any is remixed or reused, meaning even short jingles have a nice musicality present. For example, you'd expect to hear the same music when you walk through a store or game room, but instead each is given their own short composition, and this greatly elevates the player's engagement because you're always being hit with something new. The one caveat I personally have with this is that a fair number of tracks are written to support these small moments, which means the songs can often finish their loop in as early as the 30-second mark. On the one hand, this is good because that's what you want for a brief visit to the arcade. There isn't time for the song to develop, so it cuts to the punchline almost immediately. The downside is that after a while, it can give the impression that few tracks have enough room to fully develop. Nevertheless, the score manages to complement the upbeat Japanese adventure of minigames, tourist attractions, and sightseeing very well. The songs include traditional Japanese instruments like the koto stringed instrument, taiko drums, and the shakuhachi flute. It also features a variety of traditional Japanese sounding melodies, which are perhaps attributed to the use of the akibono scale. Although we're not music or Japanese experts, so don't quote us on any of this. Mystical Ninja takes these traditional Japanese instruments and melodies and combines them with a punchy and catchy bass line, upbeat electronic sounds, and Japanese pop influences. This gives the soundtrack a unique sound, but it also allows it to match the action and push the player onwards to further adventures. The combinations of old and new elements also matches the anachronistic elements of the game, such as the prevalence of ninjas and samurai at amusement parks and burger shops. Finally, the songs often have a mix of major and minor melodies, which can create nostalgia despite none of us having grown up with the game. It's a great soundtrack from the era, and one that you can easily put on to relax, jam out, or go on a little Japanese flavored adventure in your mind. Legend of the Mystical Ninja is up for Best Art Direction and Best Musical Score. Shining in the Darkness is a first-person role-playing dungeon crawler developed by Climax Entertainment and Sonic Software Planning, now known as Camelot Software Planning. It was published on the Sega Genesis and is the first game in the Shining series, as well as the first game developed by both studios. In Shining, you take on the role of a young knight tasked with saving a princess, who has allegedly been taken by an evildoer. It's pretty basic stuff, but the game has a very creative way in how it conveys all of this to the player. Its 2 nominations include Best Gameplay, Discovery and Expression, and Best Interface. At the time, games with the monotonous design philosophy of being one massively elongated series of random encounters, Shining stands out among its peers. And while we can be understanding of the fact that repetitive grinding was less frowned upon in 1991, nowadays it's easier to hand-wave it as obnoxious padding. This begs the question, what makes Shining in the Darkness unique? The first way it separates itself is with its ingenious interface. When the game begins, you are greeted to an old man napping in a rocking chair. He wakes up and asks you if you'd like to hear a story. The story he tells are the events of the game proper. This is an excellent way to add flavor and expression to what would otherwise be a generic menu screen. But most importantly, it sets the proper tone for what you're about to experience. The most striking thing about this game is its inventive menus, which utilize animated images to convey actions. You don't select yes or no when talking to NPCs. Instead, you choose from an icon of a nod or a shake of the head. Nowadays, this is fairly common practice. Why wouldn't you use iconography to convey meaning? But Shining in the Darkness was quite possibly the first game to ever execute this idea in a big way. If you've played any RPG from the time, something like Dragon Warrior or Dragon Quest for example, it's clear how often games would resort to still images or oftentimes merely basic text. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and here that is a key way in which you not only understand what you're doing, but in how you stay engaged in the experience. The animated sword swiping through the air breathes just that little bit of life into an otherwise stale encounter. Enemies you fight along the journey can sometimes be seen with animated intros, adding in a touch of movement. They can also be layered over one another, which is a step up from stagnant images designated to exact spots. It's another small thing, but this also helps prevent your eyes from being locked into the same spot where you know the enemy will spawn. Moving them around a little puts a little bit of distance from the overly scripted approach we've seen elsewhere. All of that speaks to the game's pioneering interface. But what about the gameplay? While the grind to get your character's power up is a bit on the sluggish side to start, there is a unique benefit in that upon subsequent returns to the dungeon, your mental map will be put to the test. Through repeated environmental design, this game is able to create scenarios where you reach a point where you feel truly lost. The walls all look the same, with very minor differences, and the winding pathways can be hard to notice your progress. But if the game didn't let you get lost, you wouldn't be able to experience the sensation of finding your pathway home again. To make another unfavorable comparison with Dragon Quest, in those games, frequently you are left to meander a controlled environment to battle enemies repeatedly, until eventually the game decides you have earned the right to continue exploration. And don't get me wrong, there is a charm to Dragon Warrior, a kind of satisfaction in the slow burn of a good grind. And yet, I gotta give it to Shining in the Darkness here. Uncovering new areas and enemies in the dungeon is a tense yet exhilarating experience. Those new enemies are a marker that you aren't lost, but you are treading on more and more dangerous territory. And if that enemy is particularly important, the Threshold Guardian walks onto the stage rather than materializing out of thin air, making for a more cinematic moment. It's also worth noting that experience points are not nearly as restrictive as the game's early impressions give off. After about 2 hours of back and forth slime killing and in-resting, you should be leveled enough to take on the Kaiser Crab mini-boss. Once he's defeated, you'll gain 2 companions in the form of Milo and Pyra, a cleric and a witch respectively. You'll spend a little time familiarizing yourself with your new underleveled squad, but in total, after about that 2-hour mark, you have enough to simply proceed. I found that I was earning plenty of experience and gold just by heading into the dungeon and exploring areas I hadn't reached before until my health pools got exceedingly low. I never needed to stop and grind after I acquired my companions. As for the navigational element, I know not everyone will appreciate the way in which the game, in no short of words, forces you to learn the dungeon layouts. But I think if you play it, you'll realize how it adds an extra layer of thinking to what would otherwise be monotony. Pyra can learn a spell that allows you to see a map of your current position. It does cost a magic point, which is a bit harsh, and while it doesn't show you everything, I will add that the game isn't very long. The magic point tax serves the role of heightening the tension the deeper you go. If you run out of magic, it's only a matter of time before the enemies overwhelm you, and since you are delving very deep into the dungeons, it puts pressure on the player to do or die. There is an item that allows you to warp out at virtually any time, but it's up to you to prioritize safety since it will be a trek to get back to where you were. Personally, it feels reminiscent of many roguelikes. In fact, a roguelike in this style could actually make for a very interesting retro-inspired experience, but I'm getting off topic. The dungeons are also connected with layers, meaning you can use ropes to jump from one layer to the next, giving a great sense of depth to the labyrinth. You can pencil out the borders of the dungeon as you go, should you feel so inclined to find your way, but now that we live in the age of the internet, you can simply look up a map online. Either way, the navigational elements add to the play experience in a way that other games of both RPG adventure and dungeon crawlers don't always nail down in the same way. You do feel truly like you're trapped in a dungeon, going back to your map and checking where you've been to see where you can go next. Personally, I've always loved the idea of this kind of game, but it's been rare to find one that I actually finish. It's simple monster slaying meets tests of memory. You ratchet up on experience points to progress deeper into more deadly zones. Generally, these games are much too slow and exhaustive to really stick with. Here, not only do you level quickly, but battles are frequently very short, so they never impede on your sense of direction enough to annoy. One of the moment-to-moment gameplay elements that was especially unique was the fact that enemies spawn in as groups. This is important because there are some magic spells and weapons that will target multiple enemies. This causes you to weigh how you should expend your resources in order to kill the most enemies in as few moves as possible, with as few resources spent. This method of grouping enemies into sets adds some desperately needed variety to the genre of repetitive encounters. That said, there are a few missteps. For one, the only character to wield a weapon that can damage groups was Pyra with her whip. Early game, I saved gold for the Thorn Whip and found that once I had given it to her, it took ages for her magic spells to catch up in raw damage output. And this is a real shame since the animations for magic abilities greatly helps bring the player into the experience. And then you have your inventory, which is definitely a bit more restrictive than it needs to be. Many of the items you discover in chests could stand to be more interesting as well, as too often I'd pick up some petty cash or an item I could have easily lived without. That said, the rewards of exploration are there because there is at least 1 or 2 valuable equipment in each zone, to say nothing of the surprise enemies in chests. And yes, the encounter rate is much higher than it should be, but like I said, it's rare for a fight to last longer than 2 rounds. Another complaint with the inventory is that you have to own items or weapons and cast one of Milo's spells in order to identify what it is. And even then, the thing I want to know is how much damage it does and who can wield it, so I know whether or not it's worth investing in. Perhaps this is the point though, to discover for yourself by equipping it and seeing what you can make happen. My final complaint is that even though dungeon navigation is in top form here, many of the dungeon layers use the same color palette for the walls and floors. It does change the deeper you go, but this portion of the game is quite exhaustive to get there. I'm one of those players who needs something aesthetically stimulating to keep me going, and because spells cost magic and were less powerful than Pyro's whip, it did eventually lose a lot of steam for me. Nevertheless, it is a game focused on providing a good dungeon crawling experience, and if it's a genre you like, you'll definitely not want to pass it up. If it isn't, you might just want to try it anyways, since you might find the cast of characters and lovable art direction to be enough to venture forth. While Shining isn't perfect, it goes some way forward in rectifying the mundane nature of this style of game, and that makes it one of those games worth revisiting. Shining in the Darkness is up for Best Gameplay, Discovery, and Expression, and for Best Interface. Super C is the sequel to Contra. Both games are iconic action pieces produced by Konami. Wearing their inspiration on their sleeves, you take on the role of a muscle-bound badass and shoot your way through a rogue mercenary group, only to discover they have been possessed by aliens. And you're a perfect recreation of 80s action movies like Terminator, Alien, and Rambo. Super C earned 1 nomination for Best Gameplay, Challenge, and Achievement. While Contra set something of a gold standard for NES shooter action, Super C came out very close to the launch of new hardware with all their fancy graphics. It also didn't help that the title wasn't Contra 2, but Super, even though it's not on the Super Nintendo. Evidently, the word Contra was becoming too politicized at the launch of the original game, and so they opted to just use the letter C instead, because C can only stand for one thing, apparently. To be honest, that probably wasn't a bad call at all, as Contra was widely popular. It was a must-own if you had an NES, and yet Super C can sometimes be seen as the forgotten middle child, but where the original refined the arcade cabinet from which it was based, Super C does similarly, taking everything NES Contra did and cranking it up to 11. The original was one of my favorite NES games as a kid, but I wouldn't get the chance to play Super C until a few years ago. With one game's memories as a backdrop, the first thing to adapt to is just how fast Super C is by comparison. No longer are the developers timid, sending the occasional bullet at you in a reasonably slow manner. In Super C, you have to look alive from the word C. While it takes some getting used to, it's important to remember that action games are all about the moment-to-moment gameplay, spectacle, and being able to beat them in a single sitting. The challenge is to try again if you fail. The famous Konami code makes a return here, though it is a bit different, granting you 10 lives and 3 continues. The original would give you 30 lives and 1 continue, though 30 is very excessive. A 10 life 3 continue is a fair exchange because it prevents you from spamming lives to get through difficult choke points. In effect, it no longer lets you cheat and is understandably reined in. With experience from both entries, this one very much has more staying power. Replaying it is a much more rewarding challenge because the pressure is much higher. I mean, just look at this insanity. But it doesn't stop at just reaction time. Contra would frequently slow you down by putting obstacles that really aren't much of a problem. Walls with spikes just demand more button presses. They don't inspire creativity, nor do they demand an alert response time. Super C guts nearly all of that, and then doubles the enemy count so that way there is always something happening. Speaking of enemies, in the original, they generally had one look that they stuck with, whereas they change colors in Super C. In fact, Super C makes them stand out in vivid monochromatic palettes. While this might hurt the believability of the world, it does serve an important function. Enemies in green and purple will only charge you, while red enemies can shoot projectiles. In this way, it's not a guessing game of who has range and who doesn't. In other words, when you see a bright red figure somewhere in the corner of your eye, you know the threat is very real, and you need that faster reaction time because the pressure is so high. Sometimes the enemies have a stronger green or purple palette, but it changes based on the location. If, for example, you're in a jungle, green enemies would be much harder to see. The jungle is my favorite level actually, because you're able to duck underwater to avoid gunfire. This was technically something you could do in the original, but there wasn't really a point, since projectiles would never be sent your way while you were in water. And that was a consequence of that game's emphasis on platforming. This jungle stage in Super C has basically no platforming. The action takes center stage. There are so many jumps in the original Contra that simply don't have to be there. Platforming is all well and fun, but if the player is here for the action, you can hinder that experience with the inclusion of unnecessary mechanics. Super C heavily reduces platforming and gets you focused on the straight gunplay in a more tactile fashion. And then of course you have the bosses. In Contra, many of them are very one-note, if they are able to put up a fight at all. Super C takes them to a new level with multiple projectile attacks, different movements that you can watch to avoid, and even some surprises. Don't get me wrong, I love Contra, but after really taking my time, it's clear that Super C is a very different beast, and it's different in the way a sequel to the original should be. If there's one thing I don't know that I love, is the fact that enemies will spawn behind you, and often. And when they do, you have very little time to react. Frequently, you have to turn around, pop off a shot, and all it does is really give you the sense of being surrounded. The reason I don't love it is it can feel a bit like a disingenuous way to just relentlessly throw bodies at the player. People like to complain that Castlevania 4 has sprites that are too large and that this allegedly harms your reaction time, while Super C has sprites nearly half the size and far less reaction time. There's a difference in having one bat fly at your face compared to repeated enemies flanking you, jumping down from all sides, trying to create the manliest dogpile in history. Everything is a hitbox, and they all have Bill Razor and Lance Bean written on them. Despite their relative cheapness, the one thing we can acknowledge is that the game keeps you on your toes. This isn't a methodical journey like Castlevania. You're in a war zone, and for better or worse, that message comes through crystal clear. I'd be remiss not to mention the weapon upgrades. Weapon upgrades are lost upon death, a staple from the time. Yes, this is a system of punishing you for doing badly, but generally a new weapon isn't far behind. There are a number of different weapons you can get from a rapid-firing machine gun, a lethal but slow laser, and the fireball has gotten a facelift to be actually helpful with some explosive AoE effect on impact. But the king of them all remains the spread gun, the weapon that coats the screen with bullets. Whenever you get it, the goal is to pave the way clear and don't get hit. But like really don't get hit. In true Contra fashion, you can also play the game in 2-player mode, which in many ways makes the game harder. It's not that you can shoot one another because you can't, but it does demand that both players be as in sync as possible with each other. If one player moves too far ahead, it will drag the screen and kill the other. Still, this is a far better experience than something like Battletoads. Battletoads has its charm, but you're constantly disrupting the other player. Super C has it all: dedicated action over platforming and gimmicks, power-ups, a wide variety of unique bosses, 2-player mode, and a code to soften the experience if you're new, but also not one that trivializes the experience. Super C is up for Best Gameplay, Challenge, and Achievement. UN Squadron is a side-scrolling shooter developed and published by Capcom. Based on the anime series entitled Area 88, it was released for the Super Nintendo in 1991, and sees players take on the role of one of 3 pilots from the show, each with their own strengths and weaknesses as they take on mercenary jobs in thrilling flight combat scenarios. It has 1 nomination for Best Gameplay, Challenge, and Achievement. Back in 2015, I had built a draft of potentially doing this very award ceremony. At the time, I was limited to just Super Nintendo as it was only a test run, but in the rare off hours of my college classes, I would research popular games from 90 and 91, and UN Squadron was one of those that came up. I wouldn't say I'm much for scrolling shooters, and the generic sounding name and image of a bland fighter pilot really didn't appeal to me. But to give you an impression of the high regard I had for it, I ended up giving it 5 nominations, including Best Pixel, Direction, and Visual Engineering, as was the original title, and a win for gameplay. So the 2 big questions we have to answer is what made this game so great, and does it still hold up to that original gameplay standard? The game sees you choose missions from a mix of mandatory and optional missions. The mandatory missions tend to be longer and have a boss at the end, while the side missions won't earn you as much cash due to their short length. But they are easier, and if they are ignored for too long, eventually they will inch their way towards Area 88 and threaten your humble abode. When you select a mission, the commander will give you some advice on how to handle either the mission or the boss. These tips are actually invaluable since you can choose different planes and an assortment of different bombs to complement the projected problems you face. Once you're in the air, you're in one of, if not the, most demanding flight simulators of all time. If your reaction time is off by even a split second, you're dead. Though dead is perhaps a bit of a misnomer. Unlike other aerial shooters at the time, you actually have a fair-sized health bar. When you get hit, your pilot will essentially enter red alert status for a few seconds while they make repairs. All functionality remains until systems are back up. Get hit again before this timer resets, however, and you're a goner. The better you perform in a mission, the greater the reward in hard cash. You can even challenge yourself by conserving your sub-weapons. If you do, whatever you don't use gets refunded back to you, just like it does in the show. It's a nice attention to detail that really grounds the experience. Another small thing I like is that the mission success screen will actually reflect the exact plane you're flying. These details aren't necessarily gameplay points, but I did want to mention them to demonstrate how cohesive everything fits together. For whatever reason, there are practically infinite side-scrolling shooters, and it's pretty rare for them to stand out from one another. UN Squadron is truly one of the best though, and a prime example of not only how to do the genre well, but gameplay in general. This game will tap into your fight or flight instincts much better than something like Darius Twin. Darius Twin is a fun game for what it is, and is one I have a lot of nostalgia for, but the reality is it can be a little formulaic. Enemies come at you in a specific set of groups, and they basically never deviate from the word start. The bosses are completely abusable, and you spend a fair bit of time just waiting for something to happen. There's no incentive to defeat enemies because you don't get anything besides a high score. There's no limit to your sub-weapon usage either. Even the upgrades are dished out in the same way every time. I don't prefer to throw shade on another game, especially one from my childhood, but sometimes it can really help demonstrate what about something else is so great. UN Squadron has far more effort put into its numbers, levels, and enemy variety that you really can't take for granted what's been accomplished here. In UN Squadron, you never know how something is going to be used. For example, in this mountain area, we see these bombers pop up from caves rather than being launched from an aircraft carrier like we saw happen before. Or these lightweight fighters that linger in the back of the screen. They're a pain, but you can generally keep the pressure off with some homing missiles, or something that can provide an area of effect. And these things are designed for the specific scenario at hand. In other shooters, it can feel like enemies just sort of pop into existence in front of you, just so that you have something to shoot at. Whereas in a small way, UN Squadron gives the impression of some kind of intelligence fighting you, and that's a hard thing to create in such limited hardware. Fairness was very clearly at the forefront of the developers' minds. The health bar alone encourages the player to seek safety after they get hit, rather than simply take a life away, reset power-ups, or put a halt on what's going on. And if it's not generous enough, you can always play Greg, who can stomach hits for days. Mickey can carry additional sub-weapons, and Shin requires less power-ups to upgrade his forward guns. And if you get stuck or tired of dealing with a challenging mission, you can always hop into a side mission, some of which are a little diversion, nets you some cash, and keeps the gameplay fresh. And it's all up to you. After the first mission, you're free to complete a set of missions in any order. This process repeats a second time until you reach the end. The game performs fantastically well, with airplanes being visually distinct and easy to recognize, projectiles clearly visible, and in the very rare instance the game hits some slowdown, you'll be glad for the moment to catch your breath. Which leads along to my only point of criticism. This game does not mess around, and despite being fair on paper, the actual play experience is absolutely brutal. Even just watching me gives a decent impression as to how unbelievably punishing this game is. It has no problems boxing you in and pelting you with relentless gunfire. Obviously, I'm not a great player when it comes to reaction-heavy experiences, but I feel like I'm getting through a number of scraps that show I'm at least mildly competent. To reinforce just how hazardous this game is, I was playing on easy mode, with save states, and I still couldn't reach the final stage. I've beaten the game under those conditions before, but it takes a good deal of practice and patience. It would have been nice if there was a sub-weapon that could provide some kind of defensive tactic. Sure, there are some of these, but I don't mean just a good offense for a defense, I mean something that can throw up a shield or reset my health bar cooldown. Anything that allows me to take an extra hit or two would be a godsend. Alas, no such mechanism exists. The question you might be wondering is if this harsh difficulty is enough to keep the game from standing a chance at winning Best Gameplay Challenge and Achievement. And the answer is, not necessarily. Challenge and Achievement should honor the best designed gameplay first and foremost. UN Squadron very much embodies that spirit. The issue has more to do with it being the kind of experience not everyone can do well. The category is interested in games that create a healthy balance between frustration and fun. And while Squadron does meet that criteria, I do think it positions itself more as the best of a niche genre. This is not the kind of game anyone can just pick up and enjoy. You need to sharpen your skills in order to fully enjoy what this game has on offer. If you can though, I promise you won't be disappointed. UN Squadron is up for Best Gameplay, Challenge, and Achievement. What can you say about the mustache man himself? Super Mario World is perhaps one of the most well-known Mario platforming adventures. Technically, this is the fourth entry in Nintendo's flagship franchise, but the name World really is appropriately chosen, as it is a massive game with close to 100 levels, making it an easy target for its one nomination for Best Level Design. Despite its reputation, Super Mario World was unable to garner more than its single nomination here at the Oscarinas. A snub? Perhaps, but when we consider the sort of experiences we value, we ultimately look for games that push the envelope with stories and aesthetics. In other words, we're trying to identify games that walk the closest line with art, with a capital A. While it's true you could argue Mario World is art, and I don't think we would disagree, but the very construction of the Mario universe is rooted in business strategies rather than having something to say about the human condition. In Mario, you play a plumber who must save a princess from a giant evil turtle. Along the way, you'll eat mushrooms to enlarge yourself, flowers that enable you to throw fireballs, and ride a dinosaur as you jump on mushroom people. And who could forget the man-eating plants that live in sewage pipes? The world is extremely creative, yes, but it's equally nonsensical. I think it's fair to say it doesn't accomplish a whole lot with its acid trip of a premise. And by that I mean it doesn't address anything related to the human condition. And from that perspective, it's hopefully a bit easier to understand how it didn't garner the praise many others bestow. However, credit where credit is due. And it's important to recognize good design when it hits you in the face as hard as Super Mario World. There is perhaps no category more fitting than the gold standard of level design for Super Mario World. So what makes it so rich? Let's take a look. In Super Mario World, each level will take you about 1.5 minutes to complete, assuming you don't die, of course. You will be dying a decent amount though. In general, you only have 1 hit point, but if you eat a mushroom, you'll grow larger and be able to stomach an extra hit. You can also eat a flower or a feather to gain the ability to throw fireballs or fly respectively. Finally, you can keep one of these items in reserve, so you can stack about 3 hits in all. This might sound a bit harsh, but with the levels being so short, it actually works in its favor. You never feel like you're replaying large chunks of content. Each level also comes with a checkpoint at the halfway mark to compensate. And these checkpoints also encourage you to make another attempt at the stage, since you'll lose that checkpoint if you go elsewhere. What I think is especially good is that whenever there is a mechanic in the game, the player is always prompted into action. Those checkpoints are not given out for free. You actually have to run through them. Your backup power-up isn't granted out of nowhere. It drops from the ceiling, and you have to go out and grab it if you want it. This can lead to some very frantic moments, since the designers never know exactly when it's going to be convenient to recollect your stored power-up. And yet, if you need it, it's no doubt because you recently got hit. So it basically always drops in a situation in which A, it is needed, and B, you're very likely to still be in trouble. There is technically a 4th stack in the form of Yoshi. You can ride Yoshi and utilize his ability to eat almost anything. While Mario can carry objects with him, Yoshi takes this a step further by carrying objects in his mouth, some of which gain mystical powers when they are held or spat out. For example, a red Koopa shell will burst into 3 fire projectiles, while a blue shell will give Yoshi wings to fly. While some combinations make certain levels easier, they are all built to function with or without them, and in either case, the difficulty never seems to waver. Sure, it might be nice if you can take an extra hit now and then, but there are advantages to being Mini Mario, if for no other reason in that you are a much smaller target. This enables the player to simply keep playing, even if they take a hit, because it's not life lost that they have to have in order to stand a chance of progressing. The stages themselves generally pack a healthy dose of these items at regular intervals, so you're never overwhelmed with them, but never starving for them either. In terms of level completion, generally you move from one side of the screen until you reach the other, but that describes merely the surface of what's on offer. Most, if not every level, has at least one warp pipe, or a doorway that you can go through that will take you into a sub-area. Sometimes it's a bonus minigame, while at others it's a separate room that may have a power-up, or perhaps even an alternate way of completing the stage. By completing the stage through an alternate route, your pathways on the overworld map will extend beyond what initially seems visible. The world will clear a path to make room and can even come to represent the things you've accomplished. Those bonus levels are sometimes optional routes, but they can also be switch stages, which are essentially bonus stages that have a unique resolution. When you complete a switch stage, all the stages in the game will fill in blocks of that color in various places. This makes those stages a bit easier, but the player also has the option not to activate the switches to add a pinch of extra challenge to the experience. Again, this, I think, is what makes the design for Super Mario World so enjoyable to experience. The game doesn't force you down a linear path as much as you might think. Anything that is given to you is given because you took some kind of action to get it, which just means the game is in a near constant flow of momentum that is entirely player-owned and adjusted according to their choices and tastes. To top it off, you can always replay levels to grind for some 1-ups, hunt for secrets, of which there is a great deal, or just enjoy yourself. The levels themselves have a few templates the game cycles around, but there's a wide variety from forests to lakes to clouds, caves, icy caverns, underwater areas, ghost mansions, and castles. Each of these takes on properties that alter your experiences as well. For example, a ghost house doesn't have the same kind of momentum you would get from running through a plain field. Instead, it takes on a mysterious approach, challenging you to find hidden doors or pathways in order to make it through. Similarly, cloud levels generally have quite a few pitfalls, which makes sense since you are up in the sky. The possibilities really do start to feel endless after a time. Your experiences never get stale either because each area will have some guiding theme that influences the levels overall. For example, forest areas aren't inherently a puzzle to be solved, but when you get to the Forest of Illusions, they adopt some of the Ghost Manor style of gameplay to spice up the experience. I know I've not covered a specific level in more detail, but what I've tried to do is convey the baseline design philosophy that presides over the entire game. The gameplay is tactile and full of interactables, whether they be enemies or objects, and you can use them to invent creative solutions to problems or simply gain the momentum you're looking for. It's a mixture of exploration, speed, and caution that you are constantly balancing as you leap about the many places you'll visit. And as with most any game, there are a few flaws. One is that the cape power-up is potent enough to allow the player to complete entire levels effectively without playing them. I've never been able to maintain myself in the air long enough to actually accomplish this, but I remember watching my sisters do it all the time with ease as a kid. I don't think this is really a knock though. Yeah, you can cheese the level, but really they are fun enough to just play that I think you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who likes to play Super Mario World only to skip large chunks of it. The other measure I sometimes hear stacked against it is that it is significantly easier than past Mario games. I've not personally finished any of the other Mario games myself. I had the first one, and I have played the others, but Mario World is the one I remember most fondly. It's very easy to get carried away, playing the game for hours on end if you're not careful. And I suppose it's easy in the sense that I completed it without having to go back and farm for extra lives or getting a game over screen. But I don't really see it as an easy game. I think if you don't know anything about platformers, you'll actually find it to be quite challenging. But I also think it strikes a fair balance among all these things that, for the sake of preservation, it's a prime example of how to make fair and fun gameplay in a near constant stream of quality from beginning to end. The final point I want to bring up is the longevity of side-scrolling Mario. There's no shortage of Super Mario World hacks. Even full-fledged competitions such as the Vanilla Contest, in which stages by different designers are put into the same hack for a more complete experience. Nintendo themselves even recognizes the joy in its design with Mario Maker and Mario Maker 2, being games that enable players to create their own stages. And there's definitely something to be said for Super Mario World's foundational design, making it an easy nomination for Best Level Design. And with that, thank you everyone for joining me. I hope I didn't inadvertently hurt the chances for any of these games by lumping them together in one video, because they really are deserving of their achievements. To recap once more, we've covered 5 games and 7 total nominations. Legend of the Mystical Ninja is up for 2 categories, Best Art Direction and Best Musical Score. Shining in the Darkness is also up for 2 categories, in Best Gameplay, Discovery and Expression, and Best Interface. Super C and UN Squadron are up for Best Gameplay, Challenge and Achievement, and Super Mario World is up for Best Level Design.